Hey everybody, it's great to be back for this week's live stream. For those of you for whom it's the first time, I'm Thomas. I'm a publishing manager here at Voodoo.
And I'm Kaloyan. I'm also a publishing manager. Very nice to be talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we've got a really interesting live stream planned ahead for you guys. First of all, we're going to start by a quick presentation. It's going to be on how to make your games a little more interesting for players, because we see that's how the market's evolving today. So I'll go into more depth on that right now. And also just after that, we're going to answer your questions and share a brief Q&A with you guys. So right now, I'll be able to start with the quick presentation. And if you have any questions about what I'm going to talk about right now, please don't hesitate to send them on the YouTube chats, and we can answer them just after as well. Also, any questions that you might have for the rest of the live stream, please go ahead and start asking them in the live stream right now. So, to start with to you guys about depth in hyper-casual prototypes and games. So you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about this again? We've already talked about this a few times, which is true. But there's two main reasons that we think it's interesting to talk about this right now. First of all is that really this seems to be now a prerequisite for your games to work. Your games need to have depth to have good retention and to be really sticky with users and really fun. And that's kind of obvious when you look at the top charts and the games that are popular at the moment. So of course, Aquapark.io, and a big congratulations to Cassette Studios for having made such a cool game. But also not just with us, but also with our competitors. So Funrace 3D has also quite a lot of depth in it, and Train Taxi also. And we think that all of these games are really good examples about how you can create depth. So we're going to talk about that in just a sec. But first of all, why would you add depth in your game? Why is it so important to add depth in your game? A hyper-casual game essentially is just one core action that the players are going to be doing 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 times during the 7 days that they're going to be playing the game. And if it's not fun, if there's nothing behind that, if there's nothing a bit more exciting, you're not going to get your users to day 7 on it. And so depth has now become more and more important in hyper-casual prototypes. The market has changed. People are expecting slightly more complex games, slightly more interesting games. And so it's really important that you think about that when you're building your game, when you're thinking about that original concept that you want to do. So that's a bit vague, and let's go a tiny bit into detail. How do you add depth in a hyper-casual prototype? Like, what are the 3 big things that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about, okay, I've got this core gameplay, how do I make it more interesting? So first of all, most of the depth in these games is risk and reward. It's always going to be, you give the opportunity for the user to take a little risk, and in exchange for that risk, you're going to give him a big reward. It's exactly the same as all the rest of the guidelines that we have for these games. You know, it's always a little risk, a little attention, a little effort for huge amounts of reward for the user. So that means that it has to be a choice for the user. Depth comes from the choice a user makes to voluntarily make one action instead of the other, voluntarily expose herself or himself to risk in exchange for a reward. Secondly, like in everything when you make a hyper-casual game, it has to be very, very clear. You have to make sure that every alternative choice, every option is very well explained to the user, and at all times the person playing will know what to do and what it means if he takes the risk, if he goes for the depth. Thirdly, and this is kind of what we think about this, is that it's always more interesting when you link the reward of the risk taken to the gameplay, the core gameplay in itself. And I'll give a few examples of this right now. So this looks a bit intimidating, but it's super simple. It's just 4 examples of 4 very popular games and how they integrated depth, mostly risk and reward in these games. So in Helix Jump, for instance, there's one way to play very simply. You just turn the platforms, drop the ball from platform to platform. However, there's one way to play with a bit more depth. You drop the ball through multiple platforms in order to go a little bit faster. But when you do that, obviously, you're exposing yourself to risk. Who knows if you have an obstacle at the next platform that you're not seeing. And the reward of that is that you become invincible after a few drops and you break the next platform. So here, the depth is voluntary. User chooses to drop multiple platforms. It's also clear. You get really the explanation through effects and UI that the user is dropping. He accelerates, but also that he's become invincible with the little effect around the ball. And thirdly, it's really rewarding with the gameplay. You're breaking the platform, you're invincible. You know, there's an actual reward that's linked to the core gameplay, which is getting to the bottom of the tower. Another example, for instance, is our game Dune. The way to play just very simply and casually is just to keep on moving the ball through the dunes and to try and get the highest score. But the way to play with depth in this game is that you take more risk by going higher and higher and higher and dropping faster and faster and faster on the dunes. So the risk that you're taking is that if you drop too fast, you're going to miss the dune and you're going to actually die and stop playing. But if you take that risk and it pays off, then you go above a certain height and you get extra score. So here, the depth is voluntary. The user chooses to take the risk. It's also very clear. You go higher and faster, so it's very obvious. But it's not rewarding in terms of the gameplay in itself. The user's not getting, he's just getting points. He's just getting score. He's not getting invincibility or a power-up or anything. The third example is color switch. Pretty simple. The way to play casually is matching the colors. And the way to play with depth is to tap faster to keep on rising and not stopping. This is voluntary, because the user chooses to tap fast or not fast, but it's not that clear, because even though you're going to be getting more score in a quicker way, you don't actually have any UI or any effects or anything like you have in Dune or Helix Jump about how you're playing. And also, it's not rewarding in the gameplay. You're not invincible. You don't get anything at all for the game for playing with depth. It's an older game, so it's understandable, but it's a good example to show why you really need these 3 guidelines. The fourth example is Rise Up. How to play casually, pretty simple. You're just protecting a balloon and making sure that it doesn't get hit by an obstacle. How to play with depth, it's protecting yourself and the balloon by holding and stacking objects. So you kind of play really well, you kind of try and match the objects and stack them really cleanly. Again, this can be done voluntarily, but it's like in color switch. It's not clear that you can do this or that it brings any additional value to the player. And also, it's not rewarding in the gameplay. You don't get any gameplay benefits linked to the core gameplay, which is always here protecting the balloon. So this was just a quick example to explain in kind of historic hits on the App Store in the last couple of years, how you need the depth to be voluntary, clear, and rewarding towards the core gameplay. But what about today? So obviously, we're in kind of a different era for hyper-casual games. They're becoming, visually more interesting in terms of gameplay. So where do we take depth from here? And we think that Aquapark.io is a super good example of how you can use all of these guidelines, but still have the game be more modern. And what's really interesting in this game is that they actually added a secondary layer of gameplay in the game to add depth. It's not quite as linked to the original game. You jump off the kind of tube, you can float, but it is still a risk and reward system, which is clear, voluntary, and has a very, very direct link to making the player feel rewarded in the gameplay. So for us, this is a really, really good example of depth in a kind of more modern hyper-casual game. It's more exciting, it really gives a huge amount of reward, and at the same time, it's even more kind of deep and even more varied than the previous examples that we had. So definitely keep this in mind when you're making a game. Here's just a few questions you can ask yourself when you're making a prototype linked to how to find depth and how to find kind of secondary gameplays. Obviously, this is all very theoretical, so hopefully these questions would really help you just to ask yourself these questions every time you're making a prototype to see if you're on the right rails. First of all, when you make a game, is there another way to play your game which is more efficient than the way that you just thought about? For instance, Helix Jump, you can drop platform by platform. Can you find a way to make it more exciting with a slightly more advanced way to play? Secondly, is that other way to play linked to the core gameplay in any meaningful way? Does it give any advantage to the player? The example of Aquapark is really telling. Like, you have the second way to play, which is floating from kind of place to place on the tube, but it's very, very linked to the core gameplay, which is winning the race. If you take that risk, you get further in the race. Thirdly, is the reward linked to the core gameplay? Again, it's not just about having the secondary gameplay, which is similar to the first or linked to it. It's that the reward should be very positive for the user. In Helix Jump, you become invincible, and therefore you get that additional reward as well as playing better. And finally, does the user choose the risk? Because you can, just looking at this, you could base a game just on risk and reward, but it wouldn't be that interesting for the user because he's not choosing to take a risk. You're forcing him to. So it definitely has to be very voluntary. So that's the presentation about depth. Definitely, if you have any questions about this, please ask. And as you know, we'll also be sharing this presentation and the slides on the dashboard pretty soon after this live stream. So if you have any kind of, if you want to go back to it, please, we really encourage you to do so. So I think now we'll be answering a few questions.
Yep. Thank you for sending so many questions. I'll start with the first from Lutfi Altin. What do you think about the copy of the games? In the store, I see basically the same game of Voodoos with different meta. One example is Stackfall versus Stackball. Actually, there are many more. We think many things about it. The most important, I believe, for you is that you should keep innovating and don't follow that trend because it actually doesn't work. If you come after another game, your game will perform less well. It will, perform less well by a lot. So it's really not the way to go. And if you look at our biggest hits and the recent ones, the top 3 today, Aquapark, Touch the Wall, Pottery, these are 3 original ideas, and that's what has always worked, and that's what will work forever. The second thing is that we will always defend our studios. And this is where legal and other kind of actions enter, and you can trust us for that.
Yeah, absolutely. The second question is from CTMH. Can we advise on how difficult the games should be? Should you give it to non-traditional players to test it out and see if it's difficult for them? So that's actually a really good idea. You know, quite a few of the studios that we work with that have published some really high some really good hits and good games have the habit of play testing every prototype that they make. Just you go on the street, you ask 5 people to test it, and you see how they react to the difficulty, to the control system. And you don't necessarily even have to ask them questions. Just give them like a really easy level or a level you think is just really, really easy and see how they react to that. If they get stuck, if it's too hard, you probably have something which is not adapted to the difficulty of the market we're trying to target. So definitely asking these people for not advice, but just watching the way they play is a really good idea. And also just a bit more of a general advice on difficulty. Anything that is hard for you will be incredibly hard for people that are not making the game to begin with. And secondly, anything that is easy for you will probably be hard or mid-difficulty for these people. So, you know, always bear in mind, we're not making games for us. The pleasure for us and for, I think, a lot of you guys is making the game, not playing it. So it's always important to keep in mind that you're making games for non-gamers. And that means that difficulty, it's always better. Okay, maybe to put it simply, it's always better to make a game that you think is way too simple than a game you think is well balanced. Because a game you think is well balanced will be too hard, likely.
A question for homemade games. Do skins and items to unlock usually improve the day 7? I have a case that didn't. Very interesting. 2 comments about that. Skins and items to unlock can improve the day 7. It's meta gameplay features, and that's why we encourage you and ask you to test your games without it, because it's very time consuming and it doesn't work all the time. So it's way better to put them in the game after launch when we can A/B test and be sure that it's positive. So It doesn't always work. I have some good examples of game where it hasn't. Even basic skins, which has worked all the time, and it's very time consuming. So really focus on the core gameplay, focus on the game feeling, focus on depth, and making something fun to play, a core loop fun to play. You can reach the KPIs with that only, and then you will have plenty of time to do the most beautiful skins, items to unlock, challenges, anything. But this is not what matters the most. Core gameplay is success.
Always the core gameplay. Yeah, absolutely. We're just getting a few questions on how depth affects day 1, day 7 CPI from Clack TV, also from STBN0. Super interesting question. Obviously, if we kind of are encouraging you to create depth in your prototypes, is because we are absolutely certain that it increases the KPIs of your games when they're testing. And I think according to how you do it, it's going to have a positive effect on all of these KPIs. A game with more depth, obviously rationally, you think, yeah, it's going to improve day 7 because people are going to find more ways to play and they're going to play for longer. That's true, but it can also increase day 1 because if you put just that much more excitement in the game and you give the user the kind of impression that there's the possibility that he or she becomes better at the game, that's also going to improve your day 1. And then all of the rewarding elements you're going to add to create depth and to explain depth are going to be really good for CPI. So if you take the example of Aquapark, it's exactly the case where adding depth in the game and the kind of secondary gameplay improved day 1, day 7, but also CPI. So it's not a kind of magical solution and you have to find the right way to do it, but if you find the right way to do it, it should improve every single one of your KPIs during testing.
Interesting question from Jimmy Carbo. Hello, Jimmy. Do I see a trend in 3D games today, or does 2D still work? Thanks. Jimmy, you're correct. It seems that games are getting more and more 3D, more and more figurative. I think it's connected also to virality, since 3D games are very often more relatable. If you look at Aquapark, you really are displaying something that exists in real life and people will share and want to do. So I think you're correct. 3D is kind of a trend. It doesn't mean that 2D games can't work anymore, but I think we strongly encourage you to do games that are more 3D, more relatable, more connected to real life experiences that actually everybody wants to do or has done in their childhood. It's a good way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a quick, just a quick question from Line Tech Studios. Hey again, it's good to have you on the live stream, which I think is super interesting. Does merging gameplay still work as a technique for new ideas? So it's not so much that it works or that it doesn't work. I think any ideation technique that you have to find new games, any system that you have to find new games can potentially work. Apart if you're just copying, or cloning games in the charts, because obviously that's never going to work. But obviously, that there are some games that haven't been tested together, some merging of concepts that haven't been tested, and that can work. Whatever your technique for ideation is, the question that you should be asking yourself is always, is this fun? Is this exciting to play? Do I see that people are interested in playing this? And also, is it new? And whatever method you come up to finding an idea which is both fun and that's innovative, that's a good technique. Merging gameplays can be good. Obviously, if you're going to be merging like a brick breaker with another type of brick breaker, that's not going to work. But if you find something which is kind of more innovative and more interesting with that concept, then that's fine. I don't think it's a specifically bad or good way to find new ideas. It's more, is it fun? Is it new? Should always be the question that kind of is in your mind when you're trying to find new concepts.
I see two questions about depth and puzzle games from Devan Sharma and Divan Creative Studio. It's an interesting question. To be honest, I'm not sure that you can add a lot of depth in puzzle game, because if you think about it, a puzzle game is about solving a problem, and there is often one way to solve it. The only part of depth I see in puzzle games are how quickly you fix the problem or you find the solution, or how little you move in roller splat. So if you think about it, the perfect in puzzle games is often the star system, 1, 2, 3 star, or if you don't have a star system, the perfect system. So I'd say you can have depth in your puzzle game with that, but it might depend also a lot on the kind of puzzle you do, because it's a very big genre. So it's possible to have depth in puzzle game, but it's not the best genre to do so, I'd say.
Yep. And there's a kind of follow-up question to that by Homemade Games. Again, thanks, man. Could we say that moving camera like aquapark.io performs better than fixed camera like Blockbuster? It's kind of hard to answer that question in general for two reasons. First of all, the camera will depend on your concept. If you have a runner like aquapark.io, you're going to have a moving camera, and it's going to be more dynamic than Blockbuster, which is more of a kind of physics puzzle game. So definitely runners are more dynamic than physics puzzle games, and they have a tendency to be more exciting and more mass market. So in a way, yes, but I don't think it's because of the camera, it's because of the type of game that is more or less exciting. And in certain, if you check out a game like Rollersplat, it's a fixed camera, but the concept is really, really strong, and that works really, really well as well. So I don't think that you should think about your game, like build your game from the camera or from the interaction. You should build your game from the concept, from the interaction, from the dynamic you want to give to the player, and then find the best camera adapted to that. Because if you build it from the camera or from the guidelines or that kind of logic, in general you're going to end up with a game which is quite flat, and that doesn't really have that much excitement to the players. So I would really consider the problem in the other way, if you see what I mean. But it's a really interesting question. Thanks.
Question from Rock Devil's Rock. Hi. If CPI is very small, $0.2, but D1 is 20%, is it worth it to modify or abandon the game? Two things, I'd say. In that case, since CPI is super low, it's interesting to work on it. Problem is, what does it mean to have a very low CPI but a very low day one? It can mean several things. First is that people watch the video, they expect something, and it doesn't happen, and so they leave the game. It can also mean that when they enter in the game, there are crash or bugs. It's a possibility. Or maybe it's just too difficult, or difficult to understand, or to control, or they're disappointed in a way. So first of all, we'll have a look at your game to see which one you're talking about, because there is an answer for each game. And second, I really advise you to go in the streets. That's what we do sometime. And just to show the video of your game, like the top performing 30-second video of your game with the lowest CPI. Just ask random people. You show them 5-10 seconds of the video. You hide it and you ask them, what did you see? What do you expect to do? How do you control what you're supposed to control? What do you think is fun? And I believe if you do that to 5, 10, 15%, you'll have quite a roadmap to iterate on your game and improve the retention. Yep,
very true. A couple of questions that I find kind of interesting. The first one is just a very quick answer from Discover My Path TMP. Do endless games work, or is levels the way to go? If you're making a runner, a puzzle game, an aiming game, you just do levels. It works really much better in terms of retention. It also creates these little scenes for CPI. It enables you to do variety with the color schemes and the obstacles that you have. Just levels is a much more engaging way for hyper-casual games at the moment. If ever endless games are back in style, we'll let you guys know. But for the moment and for a while now, it's been levels. And the second question is from Bensus 2. If I understand well, depth is something we have got to engineer intellectually at every stage of development, from ideation to optimization. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not saying it's impossible to make a hyper-casual game today without depth. If you have just an incredible core feeling that just everybody wants to play, then it's possible maybe. But from what we've seen, a well-engineered depth mechanic is always going to help a game perform better. And so if you have a game which is just really flat, where you cannot even find, even if it's a bit contrived, even if it's a bit out there, if you just cannot find any way to add any depth in it, then that probably means that the concept isn't strong enough. It's hard to be exactly sure. It's game per game, as Kellyanne said, but it's actually really interesting to think about it exactly the way you say, something to intellectually engineer from every stage, from ideation to optimization. It's basically how I should have ended my presentation, so thank you.
There is a question from Castle Raker. Is Helix Jam the ultimate hyper-casual game that has depth? I think Helix Jump is one of the ultimate hyper-casual games because it just had tremendous success. And there are so many people everywhere in the world, everywhere we go, who have played and have Helix Jump on their phone. However, there are still many, many games which can have the same success than Helix Jump. There is still to be found.
Yep.
And Aquapark.io is also quite a big hit and really massive, and it will be. So it's not the ultimate. It's a great one, but you have many other great ones to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about that, what you say, is that it also kind of tracks the evolution of the market, right? Like Helix Jump is over a year old now, and the depth mechanic is super interesting, but it's also quite simple compared to what you have in Aquapark when you have like almost a different gameplay in the game. So I guess it changes, you know. At one time it was maybe like a really good idea, and today it still is, but you can find better, and you can find more contemporary ideas, and you can find some new mechanics and new ways to kind of add depth in these mechanics. So yeah, it's a good point. Just a kind of to continue on the depth idea. Thanks for asking so many questions, guys. From Tito Raymond, do you think depth has an impact related to gender? Not really. I mean, it depends how you generate it. If it's like very, very complex and creates a high level of difficulty, then maybe it will traditionally be a bit more masculine than feminine and a bit less kind of women friendly. But considering these are hyper casual games, if you have low CPI, you have a high chance that the games are quite balanced male female to begin with. So I wouldn't consider this as being too much of an issue. Just think about, you know, adding depth as in the most natural way possible with the original gameplay, and I wouldn't think too hard about the male-female kind of balance at that point.
A question from Homemade Games again. Do you think Aquapark.io theme played a role to its virality and success? Do you encourage game with theme? Definitely, I'd encourage it, but your theme has to be ultra casual, has to be mainstream, has to be relatable for everyone on Earth. Remember, we're doing games for everyone, mostly US, but also China, also Africa. So everybody in the world should relate to the theme you choose, and it should be so mainstream, understandable, and it can really decrease your CPI. So it's kind of always the same answer, do something fun, because if you look at the video of Aquapark, you honestly can't resist to click and just have a look. And so if your gameplay then is strong, you just look at the video, think it's fun, it looks like something you have done but in better, because I actually never jumped from the toboggan. And then people will be in your game, and when they're in your game, it's about your gameplay, about the feeling, and so that's how you make a massive hit. So definitely, theme can help virality. It doesn't mean yet that you only have to do games with strong theme like Aquapark, but it's a way to go for ideation.
And it kind of goes into our main guidelines as well, you know, that idea that we have, which is gameplay should always comes first, is that the gameplay of Aquapark.io fits really well with the theme of having a water slide and an aquapark, you know. So I don't think you should force a theme on a gameplay. A theme should be something that comes naturally from the gameplay. Always think about the gameplay and the feeling first, and then if there's an obvious theme that goes along with that, then you will find it. But don't start with the theme, otherwise your gameplay will be secondary, and we know that that's not a good idea. Maybe a couple of other questions before we finish?
I have one from Pasquale33. Do you uncover depth through development or at brainstorming sessions with the team? As we often said, you have your process, and you really do it the way you want and the way it works for you guys. It's kind of an act to think about depth. It's questions you ask yourself. Once you have benchmarked a lot, you have played, I don't know, hundreds of games, you have many ideas, and you start building your idea, and you wonder, how could we improve it? How could we make it better? Then think about depth. Ask yourself a few questions that Thomas have asked in the end. Ask yourself, could there be another way to play that game? Could I give the feeling of to the user that is kind of cheating and just beating the game? How could I make it more exciting, more fun? And this is where depth intervene. You can also think about it first. It really depends on how the idea comes.
Yeah.
But definitely at every stage, ask yourself, think about it, keep it in mind. How can I make it funnier? How can I make it more deep?
Yeah, and one way you can, an additional thing I could have added in the presentation also, one thing you can think about is, for instance, I have this concept, I don't know, it's, I'm not going to give any specific concepts, but you have this idea, and you're kind of trying to break it down into how you make this a hyper-casual game, how do you simplify it, how do you casualize it, and you come up with kind of different variants for that idea. And the way, just a silly kind of little question you can ask yourself is, what's fun in this concept? Let's take, I don't know, let's take even aquapark.io. What's fun in the idea of going down a water slide? And it can be a fantasy, because aquapark.io is a complete fantasy. You don't fly when you're on a water slide, you don't bump into other people, there's no obstacles. But yet the thing is coherent, because that's the kind of best version of a water slide that you could possibly have. That's the water slide that you wanted to have when you were a kid, like huge and in the air, and you can jump from bit to bit. So, you know, it's more about that. It's more about kind of making sure and taking the time to really empathize with the players, to really understand that you know, everybody wants exciting stuff, and creating that exciting stuff is always going to be more successful and more popular and more interesting even for you to develop than thinking too hard and too rationally about it. So yeah, that idea of depth is exactly like Kellyanne said. It's a hack, you know, that can help you a lot, and it's a really interesting way to think about your games and to create more variety. But it's not, you know, the be all and end all of these games. That is always kind of, is it exciting? Is it fun? So yeah, sorry for the kind of diversion. Actually, it looks like we have a bit more time than we thought, actually,
Yeah.
so we can answer a few more questions.
I have one from Thomas Tashish I want to answer. Our .io's trending at the moment. Is Aquapark a traditional .io? So I remember I did a live stream about .io a while ago. So .io is really like, it has a definition where you get bigger by doing the same thing than others. So Aquapark is not a traditional .io. You don't get bigger. You're faster than the opponents all the time, and you see it. It's more multiplayer game, sort of, kind of
Racing game.
Yeah, racing, but you don't all start at the same spot. So it's weird. It's a weird race, and you can jump from the very second to almost the end, and there will be someone behind you all the time. So it's kind of a weird race. But back to .io games. They're not so trending. They're not as trending as they were at one point, where you just had to put .io behind your name to reduce your CPI. But nothing is never not trendy anymore, especially games like that, where you have so much to do with kind of .io games. And in a way, Aquapark is one way to see the evolution of .io. There are many other, maybe. So don't eliminate .io games from the ideas you may have. But if you do one, since there have been so many, you just need to do something different, something better than what has been done already. So multiplayer racing is a way to go. Maybe there are other ways to go. So keep it in your backlog. Keep thinking about it. If you have a game, think about .io or multiplayer, or I don't know, cooperation. Many things have not been done in that area. Yeah. So yeah, you can still work on it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And also, you have to make a difference between what is a trend and what is a genre of games. You know, like, sure, .io games may have been trending, I don't know, like 12 months ago or 18 months ago, but that doesn't mean it's not a genre of games. And if you have a new and fun idea in that genre, it works. Like, for instance, you know, you would never think as runners being a trend, because there's always runners in the top charts of the App Store. Like aquapark.io is a racing weird.io. It's also a runner game, you know, because literally that's the definition of what it is. So yeah, think of .io as a genre of game. If you have an idea that fits the .io like just right, maybe that's a good idea, you know.
The only warning I would have with .io is actually the control. It's quite difficult, and it's not the most ultra-casual control because it usually is a joystick,
Yep.
and it's a bit more difficult to understand than just tapping or swiping, like in Aquapark or Roller Splat. So that's the only warning. To compensate that complicated control that will make your D1 decrease, you need to have a game even more fun. So that's what tricky with .io.
And a lot of reward. A lot of reward. A quick question from Buiwi Shiwan. Sorry, that pronunciation is probably horrible. Would you essentially say depth needs to add fun or smart? So my gut feeling is it should always be more fun than it is smart. It's a hyper casual game, you know. You need to be very smart to make it fun, but ideally the game is just fun. If what you mean by smart is that it's creating like a thought process for the user, the player, and he has to think about it, then no. You know, it should be simple, clear choice. Left, right. Right is more challenge, but more reward. Left is more simple. You know, Aquapark basically. So fun. I think if I understand your question correctly, and if I don't, just let us know on the chat. But fun. And just a quick question from Mob Doggo Games. Do you encourage us to make games with NPCs or AIs? Well, I mean, if you see all these racing games or .io games, it's bots and kind of very simple AIs. I'm not sure what you mean by NPC. For me, NPC is more like AAA RPGs stuff. But if I understand correctly, then definitely some very simple AI should do the trick for these games.
Question from Karim. Do you think there will be a separation in casual audience where one part prefer more simple gameplay and the other more complex gameplay?
Not easy.
Yeah. In a way, it's already the case. You know, you can go play Archero or you can play all the time. So there is a separation, and it's a separation based, to me, I believe, on moment of the day and not of kind of players. Because at some part of the day I will play Archero and some other I will play all the time. But the best thing is for your game, since you want to do something very mass market, you want the maximum number of people to enter in your game, is to have a game which gives an experience for both these kind of players. So you do something that is simple for people who just want something very simple, they're not educated to video games, like Helix Jump when you jump from one platform to another. And at the same time, without hurting the experience of these players, you offer them the possibility to play only perfect. I know when I open Helix Jump, I will just try to do perfect all the time. That's my way of playing it. And it's very different from the one of these 45-year-old women in the metro. And that's what's great with big games with depth, is that every player can play its own way, simpler or more difficult, and it doesn't affect his experience. So depth is all about that. It's about giving a good experience to a lot of different kind of players.
Yep. There's two kind of linked questions I think we can answer also. One is from Mr. Timali. What is an example of a non-puzzle great game that has been a huge hit with absolutely no depth? To be very honest, I cannot, off the top of my head, think of a huge hit that has had no depth. There is always the possibility of playing faster, slower, with more intensity, and all of the games that have been really big successes. The only thing I would kind of mention is kind of what we said during the presentation, is that the depth isn't kind of perfectly well made. Like, it's either lacking in the gameplay reward aspect or the clarity aspect. Like, if you think of all the like the biggest hits that we've had, like Snake versus Block, there's depth in it. You can choose the way to go. You can choose to collect more little balls, but also you're exposing yourself to more risk because you don't know what's just after that. If you think about Helix Jump, we've talked about it. Twisty Road, you can jump off the road like in Aquapark.io. All of these games that have been kind of big, like Hall.io, you can go to try and eat some smaller stuff, but then at the same time you're going to fight over the resources with more people and maybe get swallowed, or go your own way and you swallow less stuff, but it's less risky. And all of these big games, there's an aspect of depth to it that's always there. Maybe one game and a very kind of big kind of congratulations to Anthony on that I think with very little depth is Splashy. But at the same time, there is a certain element of depth in it, because there's that idea that you can kind of collect, make your platforms grow again, so you take less risk in the future. Kind of, there was depth added to the game after launch, which really helped the game perform. So again, depth was added and the game performed better. So I can't really think of a game with really no depth in it that was a big success. And then the kind of next question linked to that, from Namit Nanja, again, sorry for pronunciation, like
Hey,
every
Namit.
time. Hey, Namit. Is adding variations of enemies or obstacles adding depth to the game? No. There's two things that are very, very different. It's variety and depth. Variety is building on a game and creating different situations for the user with the basic rules of the game. Variety is adding new obstacles in Helix Jump. Depth is in the core gameplay. It's something that whatever the obstacles, whatever the enemies, it's always going to be there. For instance, I'm sure you guys have played like Arch Hero. In Arch Hero, the closer you are to the enemies, the quicker you shoot. Whatever the enemy, it's always going to be the case. That's depth. Adding enemies is just variety. And just a quick note on that, don't add variety by adding difficulty, because players don't like that. I think that's...
As you can see, we're obsessed by Arch Hero.
Yes.
I think it's enough for today. I see the last one from Ordinatura. Can you have more than double depth, more than 2 ways to play, for example? Feel free. Maybe.
We haven't seen it too much.
I can't picture it right now, but it might be possible. And so feel free. Innovate, experiment. As long as it's fun, it's simple, it's YouTubeable, it's snackable. It's always the good way to go. Innovate and try to do things that have not been done before. And hopefully it will be a hit.
Yeah, and make it coherent. Like if you have more than 2 ways to play a game, it has to make sense, which might not be easy for the user to understand straight away. So you can try it, but definitely be careful with it, because it's going to be a tough mental exercise for you to make everything fit together, I think. Thanks a lot for the people who... Puerto Rico Tino, who said there was more depth in our live streams, which is a very, very good joke. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. It was awesome to be doing this live stream, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you very soon. Have a great week, guys.